Now I've come to the end of my useful life, and there's no point in remaining alive forever, merely becoming a burden to people. So I don't mind now, really, when it comes, as long as it's reasonably peaceful and satisfying sort of death.
The blast was so powerful that the rubber soles were torn away from the canvas uppers of the shoes.
The word that they used to use all the time, spectacular. We scored a spectacular, they would tell journalists. And it was spectacular. It was an amazing event.
Maybe in many ways the Mountbatten tragedy was, in many ways, probably one of the most positive things that happened in our relationships. And that seems an extraordinary thing to say, but you know, I mean, it was the beginning of something very positive.
The remains of Lord Mountbatten, his grandson and Lady Brabourne were taken to Finnart Camp.
Mountbatten was an old man leading an innocent life with a large number of children and grandchildren, doing no harm to anyone, quietly enjoying himself in a corner of Ireland. Why on earth should the IRA select him as a target and blow him up?
These are blows inflicted on an enemy in wartime, and what does one expect?
In August 1979, Lord Mountbatten of Burma was enjoying the final days of his annual holiday at his home on the west coast of Ireland.
Classy-born came into the family through his wife. It was Edwina Mountbatten's family property. He didn't really go there very much while she was alive, but after she died, they began this practice of annual summer holidays in which the whole family, all the children and progressively more and more grandchildren would assemble. And he attached enormous importance to this.
Every August, we all look forward to the fact that there would be a change in Mullaghmore. You'd have a pretty distinguished guest with a fairly large entourage who would visit the area every August. Shadow 5 was the focal point of their holidays, and they spent probably most of the time on the actual boat.
He'd been coming to the Irish village of Mullaghmore for nearly 20 years. Despite the continuing violence just a few miles across the border in Northern Ireland, Mountbatten, a grandson of Queen Victoria, believed he was safe.
I know it was much more intense, the security, but in August 79, there was just myself and a uniformed colleague on protection duty during the daytime.
Throughout the 70s, the IRA grew more sophisticated in its attacks, and it was about to launch its most audacious operation yet. Its target, Mountbatten himself, the last Viceroy of India, decorated war hero, and mentor to Prince Charles. Under the cover of darkness, the terrorists had placed a 50-pound bomb onto the floorboards of Mountbatten's prized motorboat, the Shadow 5, which he kept moored in Mullaghmore.
It was extremely well executed. It was easy to put a device into the boat the night before, unguarded and unattended.
Lord Mountbatten was a much-loved and well-respected member of the royal family. He had served his country at the highest level, commanding the Navy in Asia during World War II and overseeing the final days of the British Empire in India.
Mountbatten was a man of enormous qualities and virtues. He was also a liar, a self-glorifier, a man who, not deliberately, twisted the truth to suit his own purposes.
In 1979, Mountbatten had hired a 15-year-old schoolboy from Enniskillen in Northern Ireland to help him on the boat. For Paul Maxwell, it was a dream job.
I mean, he just idealised the job, really. He thought it was just fantastic. And he used to steer the boat out of the harbour in the mornings and so forth, and anyone watching, our Paul steered the boat, you know.
For over 400 years, Classy-born Castle has dominated the skyline over Mullaghmore. Built by a former British Prime Minister. During the 1960s and 70s, it was the ideal location for Mountbatten to escape the formality of life as a royal.
Classieborne was for him almost a sacred place because it was the last redoubt in which a family could gather and lead a totally normal family life with no pomposity, no formality, and yet all the kind of hallowed observances which go with regular family holidays. I think without his life in Classieborne, his whole existence as a family man would have been immeasurably impoverished.
The visits had become so regular that by the late 70s the royal party caused little disturbance to the sleepy coastal village, and the locals welcomed the employment that came with its arrival.
I had a job at Classieborne Castle. I worked there every summer. A great man indeed, but at the same time he was a very ordinary and natural person. He spoke with everybody. Everybody liked him. He always seemed to have people looking where he was. There was always interest in him, wherever he went.
Lord Mountbatten's security was assessed by the authorities in both Dublin and London. But despite the continuing troubles in the north, neither government was aware of any specific threat and advised him he was safe to travel to County Sligo.
We had no inhibition or anxiety at all because we knew that he was a very welcome visitor down there, and we were very anxious to ensure that he would always come back and welcome. It was, after all, a family place.
He was very, very ill-advised to be going there every August. What was he thinking about? And what were his security advisors thinking about?
Lord Louis Mountbatten was Prince Philip's uncle, known affectionately as Dickie. He was a prominent member of the British royal family.
Mountbatten was a central part, almost, of the post-war royal family. He, in terms of ranking in royal status, he was not particularly high, but they knew how loyal he was, how affectionate he was, and usually, on most issues, how right he was. And I do think he was greatly valued by everyone in the royal family. The Prince of Wales was extraordinarily close to Lord Mountbatten. He used to refer to him as his honorary grandfather and almost treated him as such, especially since he hadn't got a grandfather of his own. And he loved Mountbatten, he revered Mountbatten, he argued with Mountbatten, certainly, but he respected enormously Mountbatten's views, his opinions. He listened to him as he listened to nobody else. And Mountbatten was an extremely good influence in the Prince of Wales's life.
From an early age, it was clear that Mountbatten would follow his father to serve his country on the high seas. He rose through the ranks, and during World War II, came to the attention of Winston Churchill, who spoke of his admiration for Mountbatten.
Churchill admired courage, he admired enterprise, he admired imagination, and Mountbatten had all those in buckets.
The personal high point of the war came in Singapore when he received the Japanese surrender.
They needed somebody who was a bit flamboyant and who would raise the morale of what had been a rather depressed and beaten army.
New Delhi airfield and the arrival of the Viceroy designate.
It was because of this experience in Asia that in 1947 the then British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, appointed Mountbatten as the Viceroy of India, a role that would test all his political and military skills.
When Mountbatten arrived in March 1947, someone described India to be like a ship on fire in mid-ocean with ammunition in the hold. So a very volatile, bloody, unstable political situation. And what Mountbatten had was understanding of how to handle a very difficult diplomatic situation. How do we get these leaders of different political parties who have not been able to sit together on a table to discuss things in the lead up to 47? How do you get them around the table, and how do you get them to accept a compromise solution? And Mountbatten was possibly, I think, one of the best candidates to do that.
Inevitably, he made enemies. Inevitably, people thought he was being unfair, favouring one side or the other. But given the horrors that were possible, I feel only admiration for him.
Attlee's brief for Mountbatten was clear: get Britain out of India. But the ideal plan of leaving behind a united continent quickly slipped away. And as the British withdrew, the mass migration across the new boundaries between India and Pakistan resulted in bloodshed.
If you look at how partition came about, it was always going to be messy. It is impossible to expect that in the space of a few weeks, a subcontinent could be divided without rupture and bloodshed. But the scale of the bloodshed possibly took almost everyone by surprise.
Little was Lord Mountbatten to know that just over 30 years later, in a different part of the world, he himself would become victim of the violence and bloodshed born out of another contentious border. By 1979, Northern Ireland was already into its second decade of routine violence and seemingly intractable conflict.
You had this daily diet of violence. Nobody knew what was going on, and everybody kept saying, this is getting worse and worse. There was the famous phrase at the time was, this is going to get worse before it gets better.
Despite the continuing violence in Northern Ireland all through the 70s, Mountbatten and his family continued to make their annual pilgrimage to Moore in the Republic of Ireland.
Mountbatten knew that for him, a celebrity like him, with royal connections and a military background, he would consult the authorities in London. Every time they said, yes, of course, we accept the fact it is the fate, possibility of a risk, but we believe you could safely go. He so much wanted to go, in a way, that even if they'd been more discouraging, I think he might well have gone. But as it was, he did go with official blessing.
Looking back with hindsight, it's absolutely extraordinary to think that a member of the royal family should, in the middle of a violent Republican campaign, should think that he would be safe and sound in holidaying in Ireland.
I was aware of his presence there back in the very early 60s, 60 or 61, when I was in charge of the IRA. And an application came from a unit operating in West Fermanagh to deal with Lord Mountbatten. I ruled it out at the time because he was in the 26 counties and so on. Now, if he had crossed the border and that we became aware of it, that was a different matter entirely.
Successive British governments had struggled to find a political resolution. Attempts at power sharing and ceasefires had failed, and Republicans were now digging in for what they termed the Long War. Then, in the spring of 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected British Prime Minister.
Where there is doubt, may we bring faith, and where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Thatcher's not someone for whom Northern Ireland is a central issue. She's not someone who cares about the union, about issues of sovereignty, about all the kind of issues of principle that worried some people about Northern Ireland, some people in the Conservative Party about Northern Ireland. She's someone who's always slightly confused by Northern Ireland.
Margaret Thatcher had first-hand experience of the violence, losing one of her closest political friends, the MP, Éire Niamh. A bomb exploded under his car as he left the House of Commons during the British general election in 1979. It was an attack that left its mark on Thatcher.
They must never, never, never be allowed to triumph. They must never prevail.
Éire Niamh had been very important to her, both in her candidature, in her becoming a candidate to be leader of the Tory party, and so eventually Prime Minister, and then in forming her views about Northern Ireland, about which I think she knew very little at first hand, as it were, until that time. And she was still conditioned by what she had learnt from Éire Niamh.
What she does have is a very strong notion of terrorism, and she sees Northern Ireland really as
top of Margaret Thatcher's political priorities. However, the IRA, growing more and more sophisticated in its attacks, was determined to put it on her agenda.
At the beginning of the Troubles, IRA people were pouring petrol into milk bottles, putting a rag in, setting fire to it, and throwing them at the soldiers. Years passed, and they started to get fertilizer, agricultural fertilizer, and grind it down and made a bomb with some it off and sometimes didn't. Then they got gel ignite and so on. But then by the late 70s, they were into new technology, very worrying for the authorities.
In 1979, the IRA made a technological breakthrough that breathed new life into its campaign. Members of the South Armagh Brigade had come up with a new way to detonate explosives, which would later prove devastating in the attack on Mountbatten.
What the IRA started to do was to take out the mechanism which you have in hobby products like toy boats and model aircraft and adapt that in a bomb to make it go off when you literally set it off with a remote control. This particular method would set in train a whole new challenge for the British Army and the security forces in trying to counter what was highly skilled and highly technical way of setting a bomb off. Because this involved electronics, it meant that they'd come onto a completely new level of ingenuity and skill and training in being able to make such devices.
Up until the mid-70s, the IRA claimed to operate under a policy that banned all military operations in the Republic of Ireland. Despite the situation in Northern Ireland deteriorating, it remained a world away from Mullaghmore.
I could honestly say that Mullaghmore up to that stage certainly wasn't touched. Of course we're aware of the happenings in Northern Ireland because we're within 17, 18 miles of the border, but we weren't certainly any more conscious than any other part of the country.
In July 1979, the Maxwell family were settling into their holiday when they were approached by a local woman who asked if their son Paul would be interested in a summer job.
She was given the job of trying to find somebody who would act as a boat boy for the summer, basically. And she asked me if Paul would be willing to do it. And I asked him, and he was really over the moon about it, and he got the job.
Lord Mountbatten had local boat builders construct the Shadow 5 to his own specifications. Prior to his arrival, locals would prepare the boat for him. And throughout the month of August, he took to the water almost every...
It's a very, very well maintained boat with an actual toilet installed, which was unusual for boats at that stage, and quite a lot of navigational and radio equipment installed as well.
Coming from Northern Ireland, John Maxwell was used to the constant threat of violence, but in Mullaghmore, he believed his family was safe.
Well, initially when Paul took the job, I had some concerns about it, but Paul was so keen on it that I didn't like to, and I thought to myself, well, the security, if somebody wants to take Mountbatten out, they could do it in another way rather than involve small kids or anybody else that was with them at the time. And I thought the risk didn't seem to be all that high anyway.
In previous years, there was full-time protection on the boat while it was berthed in the harbour and not in use. But in August '79, that protection had been removed, I think possibly at the wishes of Lord Mountbatten. He wanted minimum security, and there were routine patrols by local patrol cars from maybe Kinlough, Bundoran, Ballyshannon, Sligo, patrolled the harbour and the surrounding areas and the main Sligo Donegal Road on a regular basis.
On the night of August 26th, the routine patrols failed to spot two men as they made their way out along Mullaghmore Harbour. The IRA team boarded the Shadow 5 and placed a 50-pound remote-controlled bomb onto the floorboards. This was the IRA showing the world a new frightening capability, both in terms of technology and execution. But unknown to them, their target may have had some sympathy for their cause. The attack was laden with symbolism. Here was the IRA driving the British establishment out of Ireland through military might. However, with the passing of time, it has emerged that Mountbatten himself may have shared the political aims of his own assassins. It seems he had been quietly voicing hopes of a united Ireland, just as he had supported the independence of India more than 3 decades earlier.
Lord Mountbatten said he wished me to know that he and
Ireland's National Archives has turned up a letter written by a Dublin diplomat in 1972 after he'd spoken to Mountbatten about the Irish constitutional question. He was doubt where the Royals stood.
They hope that this can be developed into a major advance towards the final solution. Reunification is the only eventual solution. If there's anything he can do to help, he will be most happy to cooperate.
Mountbatten was naturally liberal in his instincts. Whatever community he was in, he thought that I suspect that secretly, he thought that the end, reunification, was inevitable.
All I can say is I wish that Lord Mountbatten had spoken up about that. I'm very interested to hear that, as I haven't been aware of that up to this. But he should have spoken up, and it would have a certain impact at the time. And who knows, it might have changed or helped to change the course of history.
For Enniskillen teenager Paul Maxwell, the summer of 1979 had given him a dream job working as a boat boy for a member of the royal family. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, spent each August in Mullaghmore, County Sligo, and on the morning of August 27th, both were nearing the end of their holidays.
Paul got up as usual in the morning, and we had another couple of kids staying with us at the time, and he called one of the girls a fat lump, and which really annoyed her. And then he went out and he headed across the fields up to the castle.
It had been a dreadful summer. Weather-wise, it was just about as bad as you could get. And that date in August was the bank holiday weekend in the UK. And that Monday morning was an absolutely beautiful Monday. The weather was terrific. Beautiful morning.
Lord Mountbatten always brought with him a large party of family and friends, and they were keen to make the most of the arrival of the good conditions.
Approximately 9:30, Lord Mountbatten, after his breakfast, came out and had a brief conversation with me. He informed me that later that day, he gave no specific time, that he and his party would be going out on board Shadow 5 for a trip to examine the lobster pots.
As luck would have it, I went down to collect a paper later on in the morning, and I was watching him across on the other side of the harbour, and he was in the boat. He was sort of getting it ready to go out. And I came out from buying my paper, and he looked across, and I waved at him, and he waved back. That was the last time I had any kind of contact with him.
Meanwhile, back at Classiebawn Castle, preparations were underway for the trip on Shadow 5.
About 11 o'clock at the party, they were in and out and loading the car with picnic basket and various items. So they all bailed into the car and we headed for the... We arrived at the boat, the tide was quite low, so Lord Mountbatten, being 79 years of age, an elderly man, and the Dowager Lady Patricia Beyburn was 83. I helped them down onto the boat and remained with them on the boat for a period. So Lord Mountbatten took control of the boat himself. The Dowager Patricia Beyburn sat at the rear of the boat, along with Lady Beyburn. Lord Beyburn, Timothy and Nicholas Natchwell, twin sons, 14 years of age, and Paul Maxwell were in the main body of the boat then. Lord Mountbatten steered the boat out of the harbour, turned left and headed towards where the lobster pots were.
I had went down onto the rocks, down onto where the small wee ponds of water were just walking along the rocks. And I sat down because I seen the boat approaching. And I knew the boat was going to be lifting the lobster pot right beside me. I was really 30 yards from the boat. I wouldn't have been any further than that.
I was up reading the paper at the back of the cottage. I suppose it would have been maybe 11 o'clock or 11:30 or something like that.
I followed along the cliff face, keeping the boat under close observation at all times. So within minutes, the boat came to wee inlet where the lobster pots were.
They were chatting among themselves, like just hear them talking. And the boat was coming towards me and then turned to the right-hand side. And it was then that someone had stopped to lift the lobster pot.
I was looking down at the cliff face, directly down onto the boat.
From what I can remember, There was somebody leaning over the boat to lift the lobster pot.
It was an enormous explosion.
It just riz clean out of the water. It went straight up into the air. It didn't spread out at all. It just went straight up. And it seemed to go up into the air for about, to me, like 5 seconds before there was another merciful explosion.
Blue, red flashes emerged. A massive, mushroom-like cloud of smoke came up in front of me. I was there. I don't believe this. This isn't happening. It hasn't happened. Yet I realised it had happened right before my very eyes. When the smoke settled, all I could see was debris, life belts, pieces of timber floating on the sea. The sea was still dancing.
In a million pieces, basically. But people screaming in the water and shouting, and I just remember that very clearly, you know, the shouting and the screaming in the water.
I kind of knew straight away that it was a bomb. And I jumped into the car, and there was a Garda there. And he confirmed that it was, you know, Mountbatten's boat. And I thought, gosh, nobody could have survived that. And I kind of lost the head to some extent, I suppose, for want of a better way of putting it, and thought to myself, I'll climb down this cliff face and I'll see if I can find any sign of Paul in the water.
We had to hold him. The field was just on the edge of a cliff, and there was nothing but rocks below. If he had jumped, he would have jumped to his death. And he was so distressed. He could hear the shouts in the water too, not knowing, I suppose, if that was his son or who it was. And it was, you know, it was all very frightening.
At that stage also, quite a lot of boats that had been in the vicinity of the explosion itself had gone to the scene, and they were starting to remove the survivors and the casualties from the water.
I met a man on the harbour, and he said, there's some survivors of this, and one of them is Paul, and he's in the Pierhead Hotel. So I felt a fantastic sense of relief at that point, and ran into the Pierhead Hotel and went up and saw this boy lying. The twins, the Natchwell twins, were fair-haired, like Paul, and at first I thought it was Paul, but it turned out that it was Tim. And that was a huge letdown, of course, because then I had to start looking for Paul again. I went back down onto the harbour, and there was a boat there, and a man I know said that he had Paul's body in the boat. So I went onto the boat. Paul was just lying there, and his head was in a bucket of mackerel. And I picked him up, and his body was still warm. So I thought he might be alive, but he wasn't.
Lord Mountbatten died instantly in the attack, along with one of his grandsons, Nicholas Snatchbull. Another member of the party, Baroness Brayburn, would die the following day from her injuries.
For Mountbatten, if he had gone alone, it was just about the perfect ending. He was nearly 80, he knew he was growing old, he hated growing old. He was at sea, he was doing what he loved most. He was blown up at sea by Her Majesty's enemies. The tragedy was that these other totally innocent members of his family went along with him, and that would have obviously caused him the deepest regret.
The transformation from early morning Mullaghmore to midday in the afternoon couldn't have been more stark. If a bustling, thriving little holiday village, little port, to a little village that had been totally devastated, an air of doom and gloom and disbelief and shock had enveloped Mullaghmore and its visitors.
Whenever people were standing around the harbour talking about it afterwards, I was down in the middle of it, and I can remember telling people I saw what happened, you know. So I suppose at 14 years of age, it was a big event for me, and I was saying that, I had seen what had happened.
How did you know that it was Lord Mountbatten's boat?
Because I was there in the harbour yesterday evening and I seen his boat and I recognised it. Well, it was a green with a white tab and I just recognised it was his boat. And I knew that it was the only kind of his boat in the harbour. I knew it was him.
In military operations, things change very quickly from time to time, and sometimes on-the-spot decisions have to be taken. And I don't know what the decision-making process was in that regard. But I regret the deaths of the civilians.
I went into the morgue and I had a closer look at him in the morgue. His body was covered up, so I didn't see the injuries anymore, but his face was little pock marks on his forehead. And I went to stroke his hair, but it was sticky with seawater and oil, and it wasn't a pleasant feeling. But I knew there was no going back from that point of view. He was clearly dead. And I went outside and I sat down and I cried for a long time.
In August 1979, the IRA had struck right at the very heart of the British establishment with the killing of Lord Mountbatten of Burma while he was on holiday in Ireland. The scale of the human tragedy very quickly became a political crisis in London and Dublin as news emerged of the unprecedented atrocity.
I was on holidays in Lange, coming in from the golf course when somebody ran up to me and said, "Did you hear what has happened? Did you hear?" I said, "No, I haven't an idea, but I never knew." And my immediate reaction was to get back to Dublin as fast as I could.
And the news was about to get a whole lot worse. 2 hours after Mountbatten, the IRA again used its remote control technology to kill 18 members of the Parachute Regiment at Warrenpoint in County Down. The attacks had been planned and executed with ruthless precision.
Separately, these were two of the worst, the most awful attacks of the Troubles, with civilians and an old man dying in one attack and a lot of soldiers dying in the other. Separately, they would have still have been a tremendous shock, but together, it was almost mind-blowing, to use the word that was used in those days, that the IRA, which it seemed to be a bit dipping down, could manage this. It was a huge moment where everybody realised that the Troubles weren't just gradually going away, that this had arrived, that these people were so ruthless.
The Irish Prime Minister had cut short a holiday in Portugal and was on his way back as the rest of the cabinet met in emergency session.
It was a very steamy sort of an atmosphere. The enormity of these deaths and all this violence was fairly well accepted, realised and accepted on the Irish side.
Margaret Thatcher's immediate response was to fly into the north to visit the injured soldiers and to walk the streets of Belfast in an attempt to reassert her government's control.
Lord Mountbatten was Britain and Britain was Lord Mountbatten.
She had to make an immediate reaction as Prime Minister, and that was designed to reassure opinion in Northern Ireland. I don't think she, at that stage, saw that much was likely to come from cooperation with the Irish government. I think she thought that the Northern Irish situation had to be dealt with by the British government in Northern Ireland. And the other developments came later.
There's always a bit of the ambulance chaser about Margaret Thatcher. You know, she likes dramatic incidents with victims she can visit, and of course does go and visit the victims of Warrenpoint. And that, therefore, kind of fits in with the way she approaches Northern Ireland, always as a series of kind of discrete little episodes, rather than as a problem to which she has some overall view.
2 weeks later, the Irish Prime Minister was in London along with several members of his cabinet for the funeral of the British Royal, murdered in their territory.
I think it's an awful thing to be sad at funerals. I hope people won't cry. They must remember that all my life I've enjoyed a joke, I've enjoyed the fun of life, and I'm going to enjoy the fun of dying, and I'm only sorry I won't be there to see the fun of the funeral.
Walking to the Abbey that morning, we just walked because we were early, and there were crowds of people past. And what struck me particularly was the venom.
It was in this fevered mood that the Irish delegation led by Jack Lynch found themselves summoned to Downing Street immediately after the funeral, where they faced demands from Margaret Thatcher for greater cross-border cooperation and a new, tougher security regime.
She was committed above all, really, to the security situation and to dealing with the terrorist situation, the IRA situation in Northern Ireland on the ground. She was anxious, of course, if there could be any assistance in doing that from the government south of the border, but not really expecting very much on that score at that time.
Jack Lynch was nobody's fool. He was a very shrewd operator and very well able to handle most situations. One of the ways in which I thought we might help the Taoiseach would be to produce a document of this size which he could slip in his pocket and look at in the car on the way to the meeting, so that all the points are there. And that's the one that was used in Downing Street at that meeting in September '79. Jack Lynch opened or started at his introduction. He said, "You must appreciate, Prime Minister, that the revulsion in both countries is equal, but you are putting the blame on us. You cannot blame us because we have problems with the IRA just as you have problems. The IRA doesn't recognise our constitution. We have a problem. It's at least as big as your problem." And he continued with that argument. Somebody made the suggestion that, you know, Prime Minister, there may be a certain amount of sympathy with what the IRA are at, with their aims, not necessarily with their methods, with their aims. She became furious. She jumped up from her chair, she thumped the table and was almost about to leap over the table. "Are you condoning murder? And, you know, if this is the way you're going to, if this is your attitude, we'll finish." And Jack Lynch kind of put his hand out and told the man responsible, or he kind of said, "Look, Prime Minister, we both have the same objective. Don't continue with this sort of attitude." So she quietened down, but obviously her nerves were on edge, and the memory of all the deaths was obviously very, very live.
I remember on one occasion saying, "But murder is murder is murder." Well, we didn't need to be told that. But to try to eradicate the causes of murder, in numerous meetings with her, she had a narrow focus, to say the least, rather tunnel vision.
Mrs. Thatcher's reaction was actually quite measured. You obviously had the panic and the anger of the first few days, but she didn't say, "Right, let's bring in a whole new package of security measures. Let's bring in more shock troops."
The Irish authorities moved quickly, and within months, IRA man Thomas McMahon, who'd been arrested on the day of the attack, was jailed for life for planting the bomb on Lord Mountbatten's boat. Forensic evidence helped convict McMahon, whose boots were found to have traces of paint from the Shadow 5 on them.
We realised, we just can't react and give these fellas the right to have us all on the back foot reacting to what outrages of that nature. If we do, we'll never make progress. Never. We might as well give up the business of government and say, "OK, you guys, come on, take it over." That wasn't going to happen. Never did.
The political fallout of the IRA attack ushered in a greater understanding of the Northern Ireland troubles between both governments. Only a few months into her first term as Prime Minister, and having to deal with the assassination of a prominent member of the royal family and the massacre of 18 soldiers, Mrs. Thatcher began to realise that security measures alone would not solve the situation. Meanwhile, the Irish government had to deal with the fact that the IRA was operating in its jurisdiction at a worrying new level of ruthlessness.
Maybe in many ways the Mountbatten story, Mountbatten tragedy, in many ways probably one of the most positive things that happened in our relationships. And that seems an extraordinary thing to say, but it was the beginning of something very positive.
Mullaghmore stands alongside many other towns and villages of Ireland, whose very names are synonymous with the death and violence inflicted during the historical period now known simply as the Troubles. By killing a member of the royal family, the IRA brought international attention to the conflict, but it also heralded a new era of partnership between the Dublin and London governments.
It simply never occurred to him that anyone would attack him at sea. So knowing that, you wouldn't just be attacking him, you'd be attacking other innocent people who are out with him, you'd be attacking children, you'd be attacking women, you'd be attacking a little Irish boy who always went out with the boat. It seemed to him unthinkable.
It did the IRA's cause in this country no good whatever. That evaporated.
I think I was somewhat ashamed. In fact, I was. Still feel a bit of that. Because we had developed a relationship. We were showing our maturity as a people. We had a confidence to engage with the British government, and not always an agreement. And then to see this happen, you'd have to feel somewhat ashamed. I did. Jack did. But I think our British counterparts understood that too. So it didn't damage our relationships at all. In fact, if anything, it would have enhanced our understanding of each other.
Their feats are legendary, serving as a blueprint for warfare thousands of years later. Battles BC uses stunning graphics to show leaders from the ancient world in some of the greatest conflicts in history. See it tomorrow afternoon at 4 as part of the free weekend pass on Sky 3.